Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the killer for the upcoming RINGU chapter, Sadako Yamamura, otherwise known as the Onryo. When the RINGU chapter was announced back in December 15th, 2021, nobody really had very high expectations because it was drowned in a mire of apathy and disillusionment from the wider player base towards the recent releases. Portrait of a Murder had just launched to a mediocre at best reception, with a killer who, despite her power level, didn't really capture the imagination of many killer players, and a Survivor who by all accounts was a poorly conceived disaster zone, devoid of almost anything that made him compelling, interesting or likeable. And before that wasn't a lot better. Dead Hard Validation buffing one of the best survivor perks in the game, the arrival and catastrophic failure of skill-based matchmaking, Circle of Healing breaking the backs of half the killers in the game in a way that no new perk had ever done before, the shattering of community trust in behaviour after Pinhead's frankly excellent release was scarred by the revelation of the franchise's association with NFTs. All of these things contributed to a massive disillusionment from Dead by Daylight for huge chunks of the player base, and that dark cloud cast a shadow over the RINGU chapter announcement. Nobody was excited for it, almost nobody was even talking about it, and the few that did were typically doomsayers with prophecies of disaster and ignominy for this upcoming chapter. But everything changed on February 15th, when the PTB arrived featuring the new content, and the response was nothing short of electric. From the incredible visual and sound design to Sadako's rampantly popular power, the praise the RINGU chapter is already receiving is an unprecedented display of positivity from a community that rarely has anything positive to say about anything. And I'm here to add to that chorus of positivity, at least for the most part, because I'm absolutely overjoyed with what we have here. When looking at how licensed killers get adapted into the game, I tend to place them on a scale from perfect transition to total molten dog shit. And I put Sadako much closer to the former. Almost a perfect adaptation on the level of Pinhead or Myers. Genuinely, she's a sublimely made love letter to what could reasonably be called the definitive piece of Japanese horror cinema, and I'm going to talk about why. To do so, I'll be splitting my RINGU content into two parts. This video will be covering the killer Sadako Yamamura, and the video about the survivor Yoichi Asakawa will come in the near future. So let me start off by saying this version of Sadako seems primarily based off her appearance and story in the 1998 Japanese movie by Hideo Nataka. This is as opposed to both the version of her in the RINGU novel by Koji Suzuki that the film was based on, and the adaptation of the character featured in Gore Verbinski's 2002 remake of The Ring, who was renamed to Samara Morgan. This means I'm going to have to clear up a few misconceptions that will inevitably happen when a Japanese property that got a popular English-speaking remake gets adapted like this. For starters, Sadako, unlike Samara, is not underage. While Samara is only 8 in the story of Verbinski's Ring, Sadako is actually 19. Although with her extremely short frame in both Dead by Daylight and the movie, you'd be forgiven for thinking she was a child. Her appearance is also a dead giveaway that this is Sadako and not Samara. You'll notice Sadako is surprisingly clean for someone who spent a hell of a long time down a well. That's because Sadako as we see her isn't physically a girl in a well, but is instead a projection of how she was in life, psychically imprinted onto the tape viewed by her victims. It's something that really annoyed me about the US remake when Samara appeared ridden with mould and decay. She wasn't livestreaming her rotting corpse at the bottom of the well, it was meant to be an imprint of her hatred for the world as she manifests a version of herself through the tape. It makes total sense that she projected herself as she was when she was alive, but, gotta get those cheap zombie-style scares, am I right? Kadokawa, the rights holders for RINGU, wanted to ensure that Sadako's vaguely inhuman grace was preserved in the game, and I have to say, they've done a bang-up job with the model. Granted, Sadako isn't exactly a complex design with lots of easily missed details, but nevertheless, it's a pretty picture-perfect realization of what she looked like in the original movie, and I have nothing bad to say about it. You can also tell from her backstory that this is the Sadako from the movie and not the book, because the differences, while a little subtle, are significant enough to let us tell them apart. This version of Sadako, more like the movie, was born to a psychic and a doctor who had an affair with her, before he attempted to prove the existence of psychics using her mother's powers. When an onlooker called her out, accusing her of being a fraud, Sadako killed him with her mind, driving her and her parents into hiding before her mother, seeing who Sadako would grow up to be, took her own life by throwing herself into a volcano. The doctor, filled with anguish at what Sadako had done and what she'd driven her mother to, smashed her head in with a rock and pushed her into the well, but neither the rock nor the fall actually killed her. Sadako died eventually, but not after scraping her fingernails off trying to climb out. You could even see her missing fingernails on her character model. The backstory is identical to the one in the movies that leaves much of Sadako's true nature and power set up to the viewer's interpretation, not spelling it out for the viewers, at least for most of the film. The one in the original novel is somewhat different, and paints her in a more sympathetic light. She spent much of her youth visiting a sanatorium to see her sick father, and a doctor there sexually assaulted her, inadvertently infecting her with smallpox before learning Sadako was intersex and pushing her down the well. The tape was made out of a mixture of her rage, psychic powers, and the smallpox to make the tape's curse infectious, and the story just sort of falls apart when you talk about it too much. There's a good reason nobody really read it till the film came out. In any case, Sadako's backstory in the game integrates perfectly with the Sadako we see in the movies. It makes no reference to the sanatorium or the smallpox present in the original book, and I think that's for the best. Besides how much better known the film is than the book, I think unpacking the whole rape and smallpox backstory isn't necessary and misses the point of who Sadako is in this game. She's a vengeful spirit, angry at the world for leaving her to rot. In addition, her power set in Dead by Daylight is more reflective of her powers in the movie, and takes way more creative liberties instead of sticking to her more thoroughly explained and less ambiguous powers in the book. If you haven't watched the movie, you might be a little surprised to know Sadako is actually a surprisingly useful part of the overall narrative, despite her shadow hanging over almost every character almost all the time. The characters don't even learn about her existence until the second act, and the only death she causes before then is almost entirely off-screen, shown from Sadako's perspective in such a way that we never see how Tomoko died or what killed her, and she only appears in the flesh on camera a single time in the movie. This deliberate obfuscation of Sadako's true nature, powers and methods of killing are the core part of the tension and intrigue of RINGU, but doubtless also caused a headache for the game designers, who had to adapt a killer whose power was mostly ambiguous, unseen, or both. Most of the slashers adapted before her have had constant presences in the movies they're in, that give plenty of material for successful adaptation, with the only exception I could think of being maybe Pyramid Head, whose presence is, much like Sadako's, more atmospheric and symbolic than just a slasher chasing you. So how do you adapt a killer who isn't in 90% of her own movie into a game where she has to fit something resembling the slasher formula that can catch and kill survivors? That's a massive challenge, and honestly one I never thought Behaviour would have the bravery to undertake or the skill and artistic integrity to do it justice. But I was wrong, as I'm sure many of us were, because Sadako has actually been adapted pretty fantastically. There are a couple of key features of Sadako, her mythos and her power set that Behaviour had to take special care to adapt properly. There's the visual imagery of the well in which her corpse resides, the videotape that Sadako's victims watch to bring her curse upon them, her method of attack as she crawls out of the nearest TV set, and the 7-day timer that her victims have to free themselves of the curse by passing it on to somebody else. It's a pretty scattered set of characteristics that viewers pick up on as they're gradually sprinkled throughout RINGU, and each one has been brought to Dead by Daylight in the most faithful way I think such things could reasonably have been adapted. I think many of us are expecting the well to be a more significant part of the Onryo's presence in the game, but given how the rest of her kit span out, I'm happy with the role it plays. The well was never a weapon of Sadako's to use against people, its role was more symbolic. It was the site of her death, and as such I like that she doesn't climb out of the well or push people in like King fucking Leonidas, and it takes a more, well, background role. It's a personal place to her, and as such putting it on the map as interactable would cheapen it a bit, which is why I think it was the right call to keep it in her idle animation in the killer selection screen, because ultimately all it is a framing device for Sadako herself. It's the physical location from which her evil and power emanates. Having it be a tangible part of gameplay would be like if Amanda Young threw used needles at you like the Trickster. While it's cool to reference a particular iconic thing or moment in the movie, there's a time and place to do so. Despite being a cool visual, the world doesn't really have much more going for it than that. As such, making it a purely visual feature as she crawls out of it in the killer select screen makes a ton of sense and sets the Honoria apart from the other killers in the roster in a way that doesn't overcrowd her in-game design. And yes, before you bring it up, I know about the menu jump scare, and while I do think it is a nice way of leaning on the fourth wall a bit and makes her feel a bit more special, it really isn't scary, and I'm not going to join the crowd of wailing streamers howling like hyenas out of obviously real fear of the girl on their monitor getting briefly closer to the camera. But back on topic. I want to talk about the use of the TVs both as a method of transmission of the curse and as the portal used by Sadako to close in on her victims. This was the one element of the character they couldn't afford to not use in my opinion, because the image is so iconic and translates so well to the game. We've had several killers who created special props on the map. Plague has her pools of devotion, Freddy has the alarm clocks, Nemesis has the vaccine chests, the pig has jigsaw boxes, and Sadako follows in that tradition by filling the trial with TVs to which she can teleport. As long as they're switched on, Sadako can travel to any TV on the map in a short animation that evokes her attack on Ryuji in the movie. It's an incredibly popular image, and it's basically the cornerstone of her kit in the game. She uses the TVs to both move around the map and spread condemnation to nearby survivors. And if you don't know what that is, I'll talk about that in a minute. But for now, all you need to understand is that her power is primarily map pressure, which is a sweet thematic angle very fitting for a character like her. As I said before, Sadako isn't a terribly active threat in her story itself, mostly existing as a consequence of her curse to kill anybody who fails to pass on the tape in time. She's not like Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger, actively stalking or haunting her victims. The notion of her coming to get you is frightening enough to motivate you by itself. That's also why she's a stealth killer, I think. She spends a good portion of the match demanifested and not actually something the survivors directly worry about, allowing the threat of her arrival to function as a weapon of terror without needing her to be there, but when the time does come for you, you won't be able to run. And before I go any further, I think now's a great time to address how fantastic Sadako's animations and sound design are at making this incorporeal and inhuman threat feel native to Dead by Daylight, when logically, she really shouldn't be. She's not a slasher, she's a young woman with psychic powers, and behaviour has managed to make that work by patching up the logical snarls such an inclusion would naturally lead to. For example, her pick-up and hook animations involve her lifting the survivor telekinetically over her head. What could look really goofy or cheap is sold super well by little things, like the survivor's facial expressions when she picks them up, and how she telekinetically moves the hook down so she can place the survivor on it. And don't get me started on the use of VHS-style visual effects, nope, not that VHS, to give that authentic RINGU aesthetic that characterised the 1990s. Everything from the filter over the screen while demanifested to the sound of her palette stun, it shows that the sound and visual designers at Behaviour understood the assignment. They saw how kind of ridiculous even the idea of making Sadako fit DBD's formula is, went, hell yeah, let's roll with it, and doubled down on everything that makes RINGU special, so that even if you do think it's kind of silly in places, you have to forgive it because it just works that well. Speaking of features that just work, the 7-day death timer was the part I was worried about when I heard they were adapting Sadako into Dead by Daylight. It's probably the most identifiable part of RINGU short of Sadako arriving through the TVs. We've only had one other ability with a true passive death timer before, the reverse bear traps used by the pig. and despite being a fantastic thematic choice that provides all-important game delay, it's had a long history of creating game states that just kill you with pure RNG. Whether that's going old school with Tamper Timer and Creative Gears, or the newfangled videotape strategy, where you just AFK in front of a box and collect your kill. But they seem to have learned from their mistakes with Sadako. If anything, one could argue they've overcorrected because right now, the condemnation curse system basically does nothing, despite looking cool and thematic on paper. For anyone who doesn't know, during any trial with Sadako, the survivors have what's called a condemnation meter, which has 7 segments, 1 for each day of the curse. Once all 7 segments are full, the survivor's location is revealed to Sadako and she can instantly kill them once she downs them with a unique Mori not unlike Pyramid Head's. Side note, that Mori, the inexorable gaze, is a really nice touch to add to the killer by simply appearing and killing the survivor with a heart attack. Their face frozen and paralysed in fear like Sadako's victims in the movie. It's frankly a brilliant integration of gameplay and story, and I'm so glad they included it. The primary way this killer player can actively condemn survivors is by teleporting to a TV within 60 meters of them, which will give them a single segment of condemned. I like that this has a sort of cosmic horror vibe to it, where even setting your eyes on the abomination in front of you will scar your psyche and bring you closer to death. The survivors can choose to turn off the TVs and thus limit Sadako's map mobility at the cost of additional condemnation. They take a tape from the TV in question, which automatically gives them a single stack, and while they're carrying a tape they can turn off additional TVs at the cost of 1 extra stack per TV. But each tape they take has another TV paired with it, which the survivor will have to travel to across the map in order to put the tape back in, removing 4 stacks of condemned but allowing her to teleport to that TV. Yeah, they could just hog the tape, but if they choose to, their condemnation will rapidly stack up for as long as they're holding it, which is a really nice touch both in terms of gameplay and theme. In game, it's a great representation of the way the tapes work in the movie. Once you watch one and have its images seared into your mind, that's it, you've got a week, and your only way out is to copy it and give a tape to somebody else. Of course, you can't just directly feed your teammates to the killer in Dead by Daylight, as much as your average solo queue meg would like to think otherwise. So this is the best adaptation of parts of the problem I think DBD could feasibly manage. You take the tape and therefore the curse unto yourself, and the only way to avert your fate at Sadako's hands is to move the tape to where someone else is and leave them to deal with it later, or pass the tape on again and continue the cycle. A core theme of Ringu is the continuing consequences of generational guilt and tragedy that's symbolised by the curse and the tapes. The original sin of generations prior is passed down to other people, younger, more liberal people who didn't ask for any of this, and whose only choice to rid themselves of the pressure and problems caused by those who came before is to pass them on to someone else. It was a theme that caught audiences' attention back in 1990s Japan that put the movie on the map because of the incredible cultural relevance of that conflict between tradition and innovation at the turn of the new millennium. The videotape was a symbol of new technology, being used as a medium to express that generational tragedy. And while that object itself has kind of fallen into obscurity in the past 25 years, what it represents has never been so relevant, not just in Japan, but globally. We've all seen the headlines like millennials are killing industries, or teens are daring each other online to eat Tide Pods, or TikTok is a magnet for paedophiles. Since the 2008 financial crash, the divide between the older, wealthier generations who got their golden parachutes and the young workers who've had to make a living through multiple recessions and now a global pandemic has been extensively covered in media and remains a hot button topic to this day. There's a lot of animosity on both sides. Many older, more conservative people see the rise of new technology and a more connected, cosmopolitan world that they don't understand as a threat to the systems in which they made their money and consolidated their stranglehold on culture and politics, while younger people can often harbour resentment for the generations they see as selfish and conceited, pulling up the ladder underneath them and bemoaning their own children for living in the mess they created. And already the millennial generation hit hard by the 2008 crash are pushing their 30s and 40s. Their children are having their futures decided in a post-COVID world, and it looks like the same problems are repeating themselves all over again. The curse of prior generations passed down through technology. In that way, RINGU was weirdly prophetic, and despite the late 90s trappings of the film, Sadako Yamamura is the horror villain of this generation. Kids these days aren't scared of monsters under the bed or men in white masks with knives. They're scared because they feel powerless, like their doom was chosen for them through the carelessness or cruelty of those who came before. By choosing to adapt RINGU into Dead by Daylight, Behaviour has taken to a task many thought would be impossible, and pulled it off with style and as much faithfulness as anyone could. From the add-on choices to the animations and sound design to little details like the missing fingernails and the VHS filter while demanifested, Sadako's inclusion in the game doesn't just feel like an adaptation of the character, but a love letter. And that's always how a licensed character's inclusion should feel. The only issues I can see, aside from her balance problems caused by having the chase potential of a wet fish, were ones that could never have been avoided no matter what Behaviour did. The weapon, for example, summoning a rune in the air to act as her weapon feels more Doctor Strange than Sadako Yamamura, but it was necessary to provide a visual feedback for a hit or miss swing without actually giving her a weapon to wield, and I'm willing to forgive it because of how stylish the implementation is. Sadako was actually the only killer I've ever prestiged on the PTB because that glowing red weapon is just divine. These are the only real issues I have with Sadako. Kinda like Nemesis, she required a little bit of crowbarring to get her into the format that works for a licensed killer. But the difference between her and Nemesis, however, is that Behaviour got the thematic elements they could adapt absolutely perfectly, and sold the more challenging elements of adaptation, with animations or Easter eggs like the well that allow us to forgive their changes or absence. Something they didn't do with Nemesis, because Nemesis is a game function, who loses much of his relevance and importance outside of his context in RE3, not a complex character with themes and ideas to work with during the process of adaptation. But that's just me ranting about Nemesis as usual. I always thought before that Sadako was too good for Dead by Daylight, if that makes sense. She's such a singular character who operates so differently from the traditional slasher formula that adapting her was always going to be hard. And you can see a few rough patches in places where she doesn't really ring true to who she is in the movie. But those were going to be inevitable, and it's worth the inevitability of a few things feeling a bit wrong for a chapter and killer that gets so much right. Is Sadako the best licensed killer ever made, like some people have been saying? No. Pinhead absolutely takes that crown. Between the dissociation of Behaviour and Dead by Daylight with the Hellraiser NFT project, and the arrival of Doug fucking Bradley to lend his legendary voice to the character for the first time in 17 years, I'm sorry, but Pinhead remains the ultimate expression of what it is to be a licensed killer in Dead by Daylight. Sorry Sadako, you're great and all, but you're not Pinhead. But not Pinhead is such a high bar that it sounds like I'm being more negative than I am. Sadako is brilliant, and an inclusion in Dead by Daylight's roster worth treasuring. She's inarguably the face of Asian horror, and serves to bring Dead by Daylight to an audience that might otherwise never have given it a second look. And she does so while being an engaging and unique character, clearly made with the love and respect for the art of horror that we should be used to from Behaviour's legendary creative design teams. I know I'm far from the only person to say this, but very well done, Behaviour. I'm not the only one who can't wait for her to go live, and I just hope she gets some buffs. Because while she is fun for now, I can't help but think losing because you're playing an M1 killer on Badham or Cowshed is going to feel like pulling teeth. But we'll see. Maybe I'll be surprised and she'll actually be good when she goes live. Nevertheless, that's all I've got to say on the matter, so I'll see. Alright friends and foes, thank you so much for watching. You all know what this means, right? If you enjoyed this video, I'd recommend sharing it with others. And even if you didn't, given what you've just seen, it might be a good idea to do so anyway. And while you're here, I'd massively appreciate a subscribe and ring notification bell if you would like to be updated with future videos, such as the YouTube video that's already in production. In the description you can find links to my Twitch, my Twitter, my Discord server, and my Ko-fi and Patreon links if you feel like my content deserves your money. And, exciting news here, I've just launched an affiliate merch store with TeePublic. Using the link in the description, you can pick up a Peekaboo Victor t-shirt, or my brand new finger painting design featuring Victor and the artist making mischief with the ink pots. A super cute design made by the incredibly talented Miljami, so please do take a look at that. And that's all I have to say, so thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.